In the late 90s, I'd just come out of law enforcement training when I decided that I wanted to become a wilderness ranger. I lived in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, and got signed up for a survival camp in the area. We met at the Elkmont Campground in the Great Smoky Mountains with a group of 5 other survivalists and a group leader and his assistant. They would stay with us for 3 days and show us techniques. We went over things like setting up shelters, learning how to forage and set traps, and different ways to make a fire. We each got a backpack filled with essential things. The Elkmont Trail led to an old town that really felt eerie. The town was basically abandoned in 1992 when the leases expired, and people living there left. The place was kept up by the National Park Service and was well preserved like the logging town it used to be. We were approved by the NPS to use one of the buildings as a base for our training. We used the Little Pigeon River to get water, which we would boil to kill any bacteria. We were shown a few natural springs in the area that you could drink fresh. After the first 3 days, we were let go on our own. From the base camp, the leader would walk us several miles into the forest. Each of us were taken at different times and given a satellite radio for emergencies. The group leaders would stay at base and wait 5 days, then come get us. My first day went great. I set a couple of traps and built a decent lean-to on the side of a large boulder. My fire was doing a solid job of heating the rock wall to keep it warm inside. It was cold and there was some drizzle, but nothing major. I was only about 50 yards from the river. I ate a protein bar and some plants that I collected. After sunset, it was very dark outside the firelight. I had collected enough wood to keep any critters at bay, but I was woken in the night by the satellite phone. Another trainee was complaining about some large animal walking around his campsite. He thought it was a bear, but it sounded like it was walking on 2 legs. But I didn't hear anything else the rest of the night. The next morning, though, I found human-looking tracks, but they were much bigger than my feet, and the toes appeared claw-like. There was nothing else unusual until night 3. At around 1 a.m., a large rock hit the back of my lean-to. I figured a loose rock had rolled down from the top of the boulder. I grabbed the flashlight and assessed the damage. I rolled the rock off the shelter and figured I'd fix it up better in the morning. I started hearing noises in the woods. I shined the light that way, but saw nothing as the trees were too thick. Then something screamed. It sounded like a gorilla when it gets angry, followed by a chuffing sound, like when a dog has drank too much water, a deep in-the-throat noise. I stood there frozen, thinking it was a bear. All I had for weapons were a hatchet and a pocket knife. I threw some logs on the fire, thinking it would keep any animals away. I sat for maybe 30 minutes when another rock came hurling out of the woods and fell about 10 yards away. I knew that one wasn't from the boulder. I started feeling panicky. I stood up, hoping to make myself look large with my shadow on the boulder behind me. I heard that chuffing sound again, and smaller trees further in seemed to be moving back and forth. I could see a large black shape moving around just at the edge of where the firelight reached. I heard the thing breaking tree limbs as it walked. I estimated the shape I saw to be around 7 or 8 feet tall. I could tell where the thing's head was watching me, since every now and then I could see the eyes shine. Then it started moving away, and I heard it go into the river and cross it. I sat down and considered what I should do. It was around 2 a.m., and I didn't want to walk the 4 miles back to Elkmont in the dark. I kept nodding off, but around 4 a.m., the satellite phone turned on, and a guy was shouting, "Something's throwing rocks at me! Something huge is outside my shelter. I don't know what it is, but it's not a bear. I need help." Then another guy came on and said, "Something was walking around my camp last night, but I thought it was a bear." The guides must have woken up at this point, as the group leader got on and said they should call the Park Service to come get everyone. But that would be a matter of hours, and we should stay put. At my camp, everything was feeling normal again. Right before sunrise, I saw flashlights in the distance. I started gathering my things and putting the fire out. By the time it was out, the rangers were there with me. One of the older guys was of Native American descent. He said there were stories of wild men in those woods that didn't take to strange people using their land. I tried to ask more, but he said we do not talk of these men. We walked back to Elkmont and met the rest of the group. One guy was pretty shaken up, and I assumed he was the one yelling on the phone. He kept saying its teeth were like an ape's, that he couldn't get those teeth out of his head. I finished the training, but then I decided to go work at a state park in a more urban area. I don't know, I never wanted to feel such a primal fear as I felt that night. There's so many things that we just don't understand. The house I grew up in was very haunted. I know, everyone always thinks, why didn't you just move out, when I mention it, but it's not as easy as that. My mother inherited the house from her father when he passed away. It was completely paid off. All we had to do was pay the property taxes. We were very poor, so moving to a new house wasn't really an option. There were a few unspoken rules in the house. Probably the most important of them was never go in the basement alone. The basement was old and musty. There was only one small light installed, and the floors were still dirt. The only reason anyone needed to go down there was for laundry, and even then, they always went together. There was constant activity in the house. Items were always going missing, turning up in strange places, and hearing weird noises at night was normal. My parents tried to cover it up, but I always knew what it was. It was manageable most of the time. We could all just ignore it and move on with our life. One day, I had just gotten home from school and both my parents were at work. I'd been in the living room watching some cartoons and I thought I heard meowing. I muted the TV and walked around the house to find it. I stood next to the basement door and realized the sound had been coming from there. I hesitated for a moment. I didn't want to go in alone, but I also really wanted to see the cat. My childish desire to see the cat took over, and I started walking down the stairs. The meowing got louder as I walked down, and I started trying to call it over to me. I made it to the bottom of the steps and looked around. It hit me when I got down there that I didn't know how a cat would have gotten in there anyway. There were no windows or doors for it to have snuck in from. I didn't hear the meowing anymore as I stood at the bottom of the stairs. I was pretty creeped out and I wanted to go back upstairs and ignore this like we did everything else that happened. I heard a laugh and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't alone down there. I ran up the stairs and slammed the door behind me. I sat down on the couch and unmuted the TV. I remember panting and hyperventilating because I was so scared, but this was how we dealt with them. We just pretended they weren't there. My parents came home and I told them what happened. My mother was upset with me for going down there alone, especially when no one else was home. She made me promise never to do it again, and I did. About a week or two later, I was home alone again and doing some homework on the dining room table. I heard a light tapping on the basement door, and my head perked up. It didn't stop when I looked at it. It sounded like something wanted me to let it out of the basement. I ignored it and went to my room to finish up instead. Later that night, I had a bad dream. I woke up and walked to the kitchen to get a drink of water. While I was in the kitchen, I heard a soft creaking noise and turned around to see the basement door ajar. My heart sunk when I saw it. I didn't want to walk past it to go back to my room either, but I had to. I walked past it and pushed it shut as I walked by, but before I could walk away fully, I heard the doorknob jingling. I could see it being turned back and forth forcefully. I jumped when a banging noise came from behind it. I could see the door frame shaking under the force of it. I ran back to my room and hid under the covers of my bed. Nothing happened that I was aware of for the rest of the night, but I fell asleep shortly after getting in bed. The next morning, my mother yelled at me about leaving the basement door open and how I shouldn't have gone down there. I tried to explain what happened, but she thought I was leaving the part where I opened the door out. After that, activity got a lot worse. I heard laughing in the hallway while I was trying to sleep, light banging in the walls, things moved around a lot more. I found toys and bears broken. It was like something wanted me to let it out of the basement, and I must have. Whatever it was seemed to be fixated on me. I was the one hearing things. My stuff was missing. My parents believed me when I told them, but they didn't understand why I couldn't let it go. Something about its attachment to me felt abnormal. My mother had grown up there and never mentioned anything about it clinging to her. I finally saw it one day. It was the middle of the night and I had to use the bathroom. I ran to go as fast as I could. I finished and washed my hands quickly and went to go back to my room. The hall light was off, so I couldn't see it in great detail. But I saw a figure. A girl. She was young, probably around 10 years old. She looked at me and walked out of the hall to the living room. It looked like she wanted me to follow her, but that was the last thing I wanted to do. I ran into my parents' room and woke them up. My dad walked out and checked on it. The basement door was open, but there wasn't any other sign of her. I think we take our senses for granted. Human beings have learned to depend so much on their sense of sight that smell, sound, and touch have been forgotten. Look around. Society is built for the seeing man. Signs are posted that are never read aloud. The world is described in shapes and colors instead of in sounds or feelings. Modern adaptations may have improved the comfort of the visually impaired, but society's accessibility is too inconsistent to be depended upon. Life is not easy for the blind. I should know. I lost my sight when I was 7 years old. In some ways, I remember what it was like to see. I remember the color of the sky and the trees. Visualizing those things, if you can call it that, feels like I'm trying to recall the details of an old dream. I should apologize now before we get too much further, because my condition is going to make this encounter harder to describe than you're probably used to. If you want to tune me out, I understand. If you do listen, maybe you can offer me a small comfort after the story is shared. Maybe you can tell me that I'm not crazy. At the time, I was working out of my home in Tennessee as a licensed chiropractor. Working with my hands came natural to me. If I could feel it, I could master it. One day, I had a client visit unexpectedly. The knock at my door alerted me, and I cracked the door to ask who had come. It was a regular, or so he said. I recognized his voice, don't get me wrong, but it sounded strangely far away. It sounded mechanical, like the person in front of me was reading from a script. Still, I decided that I knew him and I welcomed him in for an impromptu appointment. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, his voice still rehearsed. When he laid face down on the table, I realized something was seriously wrong. My hands landed on his shoulders, ready to prepare the tissue for the coming exercise. But his body was cold. His skin was clammy and his muscles felt dense and rigid. If he hadn't just spoken to me, I would have thought he was dead. I pulled away and asked him if he was feeling all right. I heard a nod brush against the leather. If he was fine, why did everything feel so wrong? The answer to that question came in the form of a deafening shrill. I whipped my head around, not to face the direction of the scream, but to point my ear toward it. It was outside, some 30 meters away. The voice of the screamer, whoever it was, definitely sounded human. It sounded like a man whose neck was being stretched. The pitch got higher and louder as the shriek went on. I apologized to my client and left to pursue this voice. I trekked through my personal corner of Tennessee's outdoor offerings. I didn't stop to admire the chorus of ribbiting frogs, and the cool breeze on my skin was barely on my mind. Another scream came, and I followed that one too. I knew I was going too far. I knew I couldn't expect to go east forever and still make it back to my home. The third scream made me feel more lost than ever. It sounded like it was right on top of me. If it was, maybe sitting in a tree and looking down at the clueless human being, it didn't bother to attack or to make itself known. To my surprise, as I continued my journey, my legs suddenly broke free from the brush and landed in a clearing. This had to be the place, I thought. The only clearing in these woods that I knew of was where my house had been built. I was convinced of that until I reached the door. I tried calling out as I approached. No answer. I tried searching for distinguishing differences. The texture of the railing on the porch stairs, the smell of the dying garden along the side of the home. I'd left my house to track that screamer, to help them if I could. I headed in one direction the entire time, and then suddenly I was back home. I recognized the doormat underneath my shoes. I recognized the smell of eucalyptus candles as I turned the handle and stepped inside. I called out for my client to let him know that I'd been unsuccessful. I would be happy to finish his appointment or to reschedule. Neither of those options were necessary. The regular customer wasn't there. I searched everywhere just in case he fell asleep. He wasn't in the kitchen. He wasn't sitting on the couch. He wasn't on the table he'd laid on. The table was frigid. The couch and kitchen felt ominous, like joy had been sucked out of those rooms. For some reason, all I could think of was the client's voice. Everything he said seemed so predetermined. Was this all part of his plan? Why was his body cold? Why did he leave? I had a large glass of wine that night. The next morning, I decided to get the answers I needed. I called my regular client and asked him all of the questions that were plaguing my mind. What did he think of the noise? Where did he go? The line was quiet. I was confident that he was only silent because the screech was so weird. Certainly he was scared too. I was prepared to forgive him for evading the subject. Then he told me the truth. He had never come to my home. He couldn't have heard the noise. In that moment, with him still on the line, I felt myself being watched. I felt a cold stare on my back. I heard the weight of something large and heavy moving around the side of my house. I don't remember which of us hung up first. I only remember sitting by that phone, waiting for the feeling of the predator around me to fade. It did eventually. I'm still here after all. But what do you think? Am I crazy?